Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of For the Good podcast with myself, Hannah Springle. Today's episode is going to be all about my testimony. My objective in starting this podcast is to glorify God through sharing people's testimonies of how He redeems and restores those who love Him, even through the most difficult of life's circumstances. That is a testament to my all-time favorite verse in the Bible, and that's Romans 8:28, which states that all things work together for the good of those who love God. Life will drag you through the trenches, but Jesus will surely pull you out if you submit to Him. There is purpose in your pain. You just have to lean into God to find it. The trials and tribulations that we go through in life don't ever make sense as they're unfolding, but many of them, you will reach a point in your life in which you're able to reflect and recognize the purpose in that pain. But I truly believe that there is only one way to achieve that, and that is through Jesus Christ. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. Let me go ahead and tell you who I am today. Today, I am now, at the time of making this podcast, 30 years old. I know, crazy, still can't even wrap my head around the fact that I'm somehow 30. I've been alive for 3 decades, and what a journey it has been. I also am a mother. I have 4 children, ages 3, 6, 9, and 14. The 2 girls are my end caps. The 2 middle children are boys. I love them. They're amazing. They're incredible. I currently homeschool 3 out of 4 of them. We're very new into our homeschool journey. I'm not really equipped to give advice yet in that regard, but I'll get there. What else? I coach gymnastics. I also own a business. I run an independent salon actually from my home called Hannah Does Hair STL. So I'm a hairstylist, and I specialize in hair loss and extensions and all the things, and I've really just been blessed in that aspect as well. God has continued to pour into me in such a way that I'm able to pour back into others. And last and most important, I am a Christian. I have been walking with God for about the last 5 years since the start of recovery, and we'll get into that as we get closer to delving into my testimony. I do want to insert a trigger warning because it will contain a lot of really sensitive content, and I'm asking for grace and prayers as I try to communicate my testimony effectively and in a way that glorifies God. I don't love the idea of coming on here and starting episode 1 with content that's about me, because that's not the purpose of this podcast at all. But again, my testimony is the very basis of my faith. And so I feel like, again, just laying that foundation is pertinent in taking you guys along on this journey with me. So come with me. I'm going to take you to the very beginning of my story. And that's 1994. I was born in summer of 94, the oldest of 4 girls. The youngest sibling, just to give you an idea, is about 5 years. It's about a 5-year age gap. We were born into a home in southeastern Missouri that was just absolutely atrocious, terrible living conditions. I remember there being cockroaches, and I remember giant trash bags, black trash bags, all over the kitchen, just full of garbage that had maggots in them. A ton of animals on the property. My first childhood memory took place there. My earliest memory, which was of CSA, unfortunately, with a family friend. I'm not going to go into detail, but that is one of the first memories that my brain has stored. At some point, we ended up moving from there. The house ended up actually getting condemned, and it no longer stands. So we moved from that house to this little apartment with my grandma. My grandma was our primary caretaker, and she is completely blind. She had been blind since her late 20s. She went blind due to undiagnosed high blood pressure. And so that's the only way we've ever known her. So my blind grandma is taking care of these 4 toddlers, essentially. A lot of people ask, my mom was never addicted. She was never on drugs. Substances were never a thing. She was just very neglectful. I believe she has her own mental health, undiagnosed mental health disorders that she just never dealt with, and they caused her to just be very absent during our childhood. So now we're living in this little 1-bedroom apartment. My grandma had drug her little mattress, into the living room floor, and that's where me and the girls slept. She slept in a recliner. I also had a divine encounter with the Holy Spirit at this residence. There was one night that my siblings and I were laying in bed in the living room, and my grandma and I were talking about something. I don't remember exactly what we were talking about. I do know that I had a very vague foundation for who Jesus was, who God was, the Holy Spirit, Satan, heaven. I had really no biblical knowledge at all. I don't think I'd ever been to church at this point. However, I do remember my grandma would talk to Jesus as if he were in the room, and she would always pray out loud. And that's pretty much the extent of what I knew. So that's all to preface what I'm about to tell you. So one night we are laying down. My mom is gone, and my grandma and I are talking about my mom. And I'm asking grandma, where's mom? I'm starting to become aware of my situation, and I'm longing for my mom, and she's nowhere to be found. So I'm kind of starting to understand and ask questions. And I don't remember the exact context of the conversation that we're having, but I do remember laying on my back and looking up at the ceiling and seeing this big illumination of light. Within the glow of light was a woman who was holding a candle that was lit, that was causing the illumination that I was seeing. She had long brown hair, fair skin, and I remember her having on all white from head to toe. She had on a white gown. With the vision, I remember experiencing this physical, overwhelming rush of what I will do my best to explain. It's very hard to articulate, but just felt like this rush of adrenaline. I don't even think that's a great word, because adrenaline can only be experienced in a human sense. It was like I was superhuman. I felt invincible. I felt the most peace and serene I've ever felt. And I just remember feeling like I wanted to fight the devil, like I wanted to beat the devil up. I just felt invincible. It was the best feeling I've ever felt. And growing up and trying to understand what I experienced that night, I believe it was just a divine encounter with the Holy Spirit. Unless you've experienced that, you're probably not going to be able to grasp just how good it felt, but it was incredible. And no, unfortunately, I haven't experienced anything like that since. However, this happened very soon before the day that we would get taken away from our mother's custody for the first time. The first time we were taken away happened while we were in this apartment. From what I understand, my blind grandma couldn't really care for us adequately, and this prompted several calls to the state, and it caused them to intervene. So they came to our apartment one day and packed us up. I remember they put me and the second oldest girl in one police car, and then the 2 youngest in another. And the way that made me feel was it's also just really hard to explain. I felt like it was awful. It was a terrible feeling. I felt like they were the enemy, even though they were just there to try to help. I viewed them as a threat, because they took us away from all we'd ever known, and they separated us from each other. And it was just terrible. This would have been in around about 1999, so I would have been about 5 years old. My youngest sister would have been a baby. We ended up initially being split up and going from one home to another, the two oldest and the two youngest. It was difficult for the state to find a home that could accommodate the four of us. So that happened. Our first couple foster homes were great. We had great experiences. I remember the caretakers very well. Millie and Carla were one. Cindy and Rob were another. Shout out to you guys. Thank you for being a positive influence in such a vulnerable and scary time of our lives. So fast forward to about 2000 to 2001, I would have been about 6 years old. The state finds a home that's willing to accommodate the four of us. I get news of this. I'm ecstatic. We move in. It's a married couple that has, the wife has four of her own kids that are living there. Boy, girl. The oldest son is 8 years older than me. The youngest daughter is a couple years older than me. And the oldest daughter and I ended up getting really close. My memories there, the day that we got there, I remember walking in. It was a log cabin style home, walking in, seeing a giant staircase, a grand piano, and sitting on top of this piano was a porcelain doll that was holding a candle that looked strikingly similar to the illumination that I had seen prior. And this was not a connection I made right then and there, but looking back, I realized the significance of it. So we're living there and things start off great. We start going to church. I really enjoyed church. They were very involved in church. We got into Sunday school, vacation Bible school. I remember hearing the story of Genesis for the first time. That's when I got some sense of, Bible and God in heaven. And I'm super grateful for that. However, soon after we got there, the oldest son in the home would start to sexually abuse me. And this went on for a couple of years. Eventually, I confided in the youngest daughter that I felt close to, and it got back to the foster parents. So the foster parents called me into their room one night and started interrogating me about the accusations that I was making. And I remember them badgering me to the point where I was just in tears. They were trying to get me to say anything other than the truth. They were asking me if I'm sure it happened, if I'm sure it wasn't a dream, if I'm sure it didn't happen in a previous home or before we got put into the state's care. They asked me if I was sure that I wasn't confusing it with something that happened with my dad, because right around this time, my dad, who I'd had little to do with up to this point, had gotten arrested for child pornography, and he had a pretty condemning case, and it landed him in federal prison, and he would go on to be in federal prison for until about 2018, so for several years. And while I do have some memories of how sick my dad was, I did understand that I could make the distinction. I knew what I was saying was very much true. So that prompted the foster mom to take me to get examined by a medical examiner to check for trauma. And I remember just climbing up on that table, being naked, feeling exposed, feeling exploited, and knowing that, she was doing it to prove her son's innocent, still maintains until this day that none of these things ever happened and that I made it all up, which is really disheartening in itself. And I'll get to why that's relevant toward the middle of my testimony. But the medical examiner did not find any trauma, which I now understand why. It's because I was never raped. There was never any penetration. It was just molestation. There is a difference. One is not going to cause any trauma, right? So around the time that all of this perspired, my mom had married a man who was pretty well off and was able to provide a stable, safe home. And she got a job, and in the state's eyes, she was fit now. And so they went ahead and awarded her custody back of us. This would have been around 2002 to 2003-ish. I would have been around 8 or 9. And so I'm excited to get out of this home because I felt like their behavior toward me changed after this, and like I was treated like the villain. I was ostracized. I felt like they treated me different than all of the other kids. So when I found out that we were getting out of there, I was stoked. However, little did I know that my siblings would not be coming with me. For some reason, unbeknownst to me, still to this day, my mom let my siblings stay there and continue to be raised by these foster parents right up until adulthood. And so they ended up going on to remain a part of our lives in that capacity. So only I went to live with my mom and her husband, the house when I got there was set up to accommodate the 4 of us. I remember there was 3 bedrooms. One bedroom was set up with bunk beds for me and the second oldest, and then the 2 youngest were supposed to go in the other room. But it didn't happen that way. They did come to visit, I remember, but they primarily stayed down south. Also, where we moved was an hour north of where I was born. So it was a little ways away. But so I move, and I get to, a lot of great things happened. It was a really great neighborhood. There were a lot of kids. We had a lot of neighbors. It was a nicer, like, suburban neighborhood, and I got to experience cheerleading for the first time and found my love and my passion for it. And I started to compete, and I really enjoyed that, made some amazing friends. And shortly after that, though, the abuse with my stepfather started. He, I guess, pegged me as the perfect victim because after the way things played out in the foster home, there was no way I was ever going to let a soul know about what was, going on with him. And the abuse with him went on from around 2003 to 2008, from about 9 to 13. And things between him and I became really heated over the course of this 5 years. I despised him. Because of what he was doing to me behind closed doors, I was like suicidal at like 10 years old. I remember laying on my bedroom floor and just wanting to not be alive anymore. I'm really grateful that I didn't have access to the same resources that kids have access to today, because had I known and understood and had an awareness of the fact that we can actually end our own lives, I probably would have done it. I came to a point mentally and emotionally and spiritually where it was him or me. This man used to go skydiving all the time, and he would take me with him, and he would always talk about how when I was old enough, he was going to take me too. And he taught me how to unpack and pack a parachute. And I remember taking scissors. This is how fed up I was with him. I took scissors into the closet. I unpacked the parachute, and I sat there for a long time just contemplating cutting a hole in his parachute because I wanted him dead. I wanted him to leave me alone. And I just felt trapped because I wasn't willing to tell anyone or do anything about what he was doing to me, but I wanted it to end. That all goes to say that I do know that I told one person about the abuse as it was happening, and that was my grandma. At some point, we had started talking to each other on the phone. And just to give you an idea of how much I loved my grandma, she was like my mom. She was really all I ever knew. And I trusted her. And I always used to say when I was a kid growing up that if I had 3 wishes, my first one would be for her to see. In addition to that, I would always say that if when I died, I wanted to be buried by my grandma. That's how much I love this woman. And so she was the only soul that I trusted with this information. So she was aware. She was made aware at some point as this stuff was happening, but I made her swear not to tell. And to my knowledge, she never did. And that's something I've been trying to reconcile, because I know, having gone through what I went through, that if I knew an adult was harming a child, I would do everything in my power to put an end to it, regardless of the child's requests. So this goes on for about 5 years. One night, randomly, my mom and her husband get in some kind of explosive fight. I still don't know what it was over, but I know that this didn't happen often. It was very alarming when I heard it. I heard them, yelling. I heard things being shuffled around behind their bedroom door, and it made me very concerned for my mom. I went and grabbed some knives out of the kitchen and busted open the door and threw them at my stepdad and told him to get away from my mom. And I don't know if it was the very next day. In my mind, that's what it felt like, or days or weeks later. But I know after that, my mom came to my school. Here I am in like 7th or 8th grade. I've got this community. I've got these friends. I'm like in the thick of competing with cheerleading. And there were things I really liked about my life. Although, there were things that I really despised about it too. I was planning to go to high school with my peers, and it was a really pivotal point in my life. And little did I know, life as I knew it was about to come to an end. My mom shows up to my school with her little red Pontiac Sunfire, and it's packed to the brim of stuff, and she says, "We're moving to Grandma." And this was 2007-ish, and communication back then wasn't what it is today. I remember we had dial-up internet. If someone was on the internet, you couldn't be on the landline, and vice versa. I had never had a cell phone at this point, and so that would be the last time that I would ever see or speak to a lot of my friends. So back down to southeastern Missouri we go. My grandma has this little house that she's renting, and we move in there, and almost as soon as I get there, I lose my virginity. This would have been around 2008 at the age of 13. I don't know what was so different about this demographic from where I was, but the pressure to perform and to have sex was very much present amongst my friend group down there. It seemed like everybody was doing it, even though we had no idea what we were doing. And once I learned that I could do these things on my terms, I became hypersexual. And in 2008, I lost my virginity to another 13-year-old boy. And I say that lightly because when I engaged, the experience did not play out the way you would expect it to. I'm not going to be too detailed or too graphic, but it led me to question as I got older whether or not I was actually still a virgin at that time, because during my time with my stepdad, I became aware that he was actually drugging me. I don't know how often. I don't know the extent of what he was doing to me during the times that I was unconscious, but I know that he did assault me. And I know that I was unconscious during some of it. And to this day, I still don't know if I was actually a virgin or not when I tried to engage in my first consensual sexual act. And I will never know. That's just something that I've had to reconcile with to the best of my ability. 2009, at age 15, I became pregnant with my daughter. Her biological dad was a friend of mine that I was seeing and just kind of fooling around with because his really good friend was sleeping with my really good friend, and it was just one of those things. We were, again, kids, had no idea what we were doing. We were just no idea what we were doing. I got pregnant. As I got pregnant, I had been in pursuit of this boy that I really liked that went to my high school that was a little bit older than me. And right when I found out I was pregnant, he and I decided we were going to start dating. So I had to have two conversations, one with the father. I sat him down and I told him, I'm pregnant. It's yours. I don't want to be with you, but I would like to co-parent with you. I want to give this baby a mom and a dad. And the biological father did not take that very well, and I don't fault him for that. He wanted a family unit. He wanted to be an entity, and he also didn't have the best upbringing, and so I commend him for that. But I also sat my boyfriend down and told him, I'm pregnant, it's someone else's. I understand if you want to back out of this arrangement. And he decided he wanted to stay. He was an amazing guy. We talked about, if you stick around, I need to know that in the event that we don't work out, you'll still be there for this baby, because this baby's not choosing you. You're choosing her, and you might be all she's going to know. You're going to be dad. And he vowed to stick around, and he did for quite a while. He was an amazing guy. So the pregnancy prompted me to drop out of school. When I found out I was pregnant, was really embarrassed and ashamed, because by this point I had already made a name for myself and just went to great lengths to hide my pregnancy. I told my peers in cheerleading, I was cheering in high school. I told my peers in cheerleading that I was having a surgery, and that's why I couldn't cheer anymore. I told my cheerleading coach the truth. My best friend knew the truth. And despite my best efforts to deceive my peers, the truth spread like wildfire. Everybody knew I was pregnant. So I made my mom sign paperwork saying that she was homeschooling me so I wouldn't have to go to school and walk the halls and be pregnant. And that's what she did. I dropped out, I believe it was my sophomore year, with the plan and the goal of getting my GED in time to start college with my graduating class. And that's what I did. We moved around a bit. We started at grandma's, moved in with my mom and one of her boyfriends, who was a really good guy. Eventually, my ex and I got our first apartment together. We had our daughter. She was beautiful. That was in December of 2010. My boyfriend ended up experiencing a loss of his best friend, and that was kind of a pivotal moment in our relationship. It changed him a lot, I felt, and I also started going to college around this time and just really learning who I was. And we broke up eventually, and I got my own apartment. This would have been around 2013. We still co-parented our daughter, but I moved out on my own, and he moved and did his own thing. Very shortly after our breakup, I started seeing someone else, and this man convinced me to have a baby with him. He was living with his mom at the time we started seeing each other. He moved into my apartment. I kind of just stepped into, that now open role of the man of the household. And I remember looking back, I'm like, what was I thinking? Because he played video games all the time. I was working, going to school, taking care of my daughter, and this man somehow convinced me to have a baby with him. So I said, okay, yeah, let's do it. I was so desperate to have that that family unit that I jumped on the opportunity. So we get pregnant almost immediately. And I'm gone at school one day and I come home. This is after we found out I was pregnant. We, again, planned this pregnancy. We had a name picked out for the baby. And I come home from school one day and he's just gone. All of his things are packed up. He's nowhere to be found. I'm completely awestruck, flabbergasted, completely heartbroken because I'm like, what's going on? I track him down. I remember him talking about he was going to go have a conversation with his mom and tell her about the pregnancy. And I think that had something to do with his change of heart, because once I got to talk to him, he said that he didn't want this anymore. He wanted nothing to do with it. And I was like, even if it's just about me, like you don't want to be with me, I'm fine with that, because at this point I don't want to be with you either. But what I need to know is if you're going to help raise this baby, because I'm not going to be a single mom now of two. I've been fortunate enough to be able to give my daughter some better semblance of a life than what I had growing up. And I really felt like bringing another baby into the equation would have been selfish and unmanageable and would have taken away from her. And to my surprise, he said that he wasn't even willing to co-parent. So that prompted me to get my first abortion. That would have been in 2013. During college of 2013, I met my best friend. She and I became really close. She was a cheerleader. She didn't have the best home life, so she spent a lot of time with my daughter and I at my apartment, and we became as close as two girls could be. We were inseparable. She convinced me to try out for college cheer so that we could cheer together for the following school year. It would have been 2014 to 2015. This was 2012 to 2013. During summer of 2013, we tried out together. We made it. We were super excited, looking forward to our future in the coming school year. Little did we know she would not live to see the next school year. In October of 2013, she got in a car wreck and passed away. And that to date was one of the hardest, probably the hardest things for me to get over and for me to reconcile. She was so beautiful and so full of life, and she was really incredible. She was special. If you guys knew her, you know what I mean. Very soon after I lost her, I met who would go on to become the father of my second child, my son. From 2013 to 2014, he and I dated. He was an addict, though I did not know that at the time. He was struggling with addiction from amphetamines, and I used with him, here and there, and I feel like it was just the wrong person at the right time. One of those situations. I was in a really bad place mentally, and so I started engaging in these behaviors with him, and we started using together. I met some pretty terrible people, went some pretty terrible places in this year, and I just remember being fed up with the lifestyle. This man had moved in with me. He had his own daughter and mother of his child that he had left, and painted this whole picture for me about how awful she was to him, and moved in with me, and we started living this lifestyle together. And after about a year of this, of me trying to get him sober and trying to get us sober and keep us that way, it just got to the point where we just had an explosive falling out, and he left. And immediately after he left, I found out I was pregnant. When I let him know about the pregnancy, he created this delusion that there was no way this baby was his, and he would go on to continue to maintain that right up until I got paternity about 7 years later, and just completely turned his back on my son and I. And I maintained right up to this point that I was not an addict, that I could get clean if I wanted to. I would always compare myself to the people that I met in that lifestyle. And that may have been true. But after experiencing essentially the same thing again, only with this man, it destroyed me. And I would go on to become more sick, more engulfed in the lifestyle than I ever would during the time of this pregnancy. And also during this pregnancy, my daughter's biological dad passed away from an overdose. So I had to take her to his funeral. She was about 4 or 5 years old. I would go on to struggle in this year. I would lose my housing, move back into my grandma's. I struggled with addiction. I eventually moved back in with my mom and maintained throughout almost my entire pregnancy that I was going to get an abortion. However, being an addict and in active addiction, I found it was very difficult to arrange the means to get an abortion. The nearest clinic was over an hour away from where I lived, and then there's the aspect of money. It was like if I had one, I didn't have the other. If I had money, I didn't have transportation, and vice versa. It was just a mess. So finally, I'm 35 weeks pregnant. I have a big belly. I'm 8 months pregnant. People are telling me you're way too far along for an abortion. And that's when I come to the realization that I'm having this baby. So I seek prenatal care. My first appointment was the first time I saw my son. It was my 35-week ultrasound. And I stopped using at that point. I was honest with my doctor, and she continued to drug test me and hold me accountable and make sure I stayed clean throughout the rest of my pregnancy. In January of 2015, I had a healthy baby boy by the grace of God. I wish I could say that I never used again after that, but that's not the case. I had my son, experienced some pretty significant traumatic events at the place I had been living right after having him, and it triggered me to relapse. And so I relapsed in around 2015, 2016-ish. I continued struggling with addiction. In 2016, I end up in jail for skipping bond on some charges that I had acquired that I want to go in more depth on the legal system and how it affected me in another podcast. So I'm not going to go too far into that right now, but ultimately what I experienced triggered a relapse, and I went to jail. While I was in jail, my grandma had lost her home that she had had all these years. My grandma's house I mentioned, I had lived there periodically throughout this entire time frame. My grandma was really the only sense of stability any of my family ever had. We would go out, my aunts, me and my siblings would go out, try to, live a normal life. And when we would fail, we'd end up back at my grandma's. Her house was kind of like a revolving door. So that's what it became for me. That's what it became for my mom. So while I'm in jail, my grandma experiences a psychotic break. She has a lot of mental health issues that she's heavily medicated for. And something happened that caused her to be institutionalized. She loses her house. Therefore, my mom, my kids, they all lose their home. My mom starts staying with a man in a camper, and she decides that it's not adequate for my children, and has my sister, one of them, who again went on to be raised by my old foster mom. At some point, my foster mom and foster dad got a divorce, so now it's my foster mom and some other man. My sister comes and gets them, doesn't know what to do with them, takes them over to my old foster mom's house, and my foster mom petitions the court for termination of guardianship and is awarded temporary guardianship of my kids in 2016. So I get out of jail, find this out, I'm homeless, I have nowhere to go, find out my kids are in the last place I'd ever want them to be, and I'm just completely distraught. Don't know really what to do about it. So what do? I resort back to old people, places, and things in effort to put a roof over my head. I, of course, relapse. I'm using again, and eventually I meet this guy who's quite a bit older than me. He's single. He's pretty well off. He takes an interest in me and offers me a place to stay with him. And while he didn't end up being the best candidate, he did provide a safe place for me to live. He did provide asylum. And so I moved in with this man, and we would go on to, I don't want to say be in a relationship. We did try the relationship thing, but he wasn't healthy. I wasn't healthy, and it just wasn't healthy. So I would go on to struggle to stay sober for the next year, right up to 2017. I find out I'm pregnant with my second son. And yes, I know this is where all the Karens come out and say, well, have you never heard of birth control? Yes, of course, I've heard of birth control. Unfortunately, I lived most of my life in a state of fight or flight, and I was just surviving at that point. Birth control was not on my radar. And I'm grateful that things played out the way they did, because I have 4 incredible children, and I can honestly say I would not change a thing about the way my testimony played out. So in 2017, I find out I'm pregnant. I know that it's not with the guy that I'm living with. It's with somebody else, because the guy that I'm living with, we were sleeping together. We were never careful. He wanted to have a kid. He didn't have any. He and I both thought he couldn't have any children. And so when I told him, he did not take that for fact. He did not want to believe that it wasn't his baby. So we stayed together until I had my son. I had my son in March of 2018. And when the baby was born, it was very obvious whose baby it was. It was the man that I had slept with during a period of falling out that I'm just going to call him my roommate and I had. The baby looked just like him. He was adorable. And so the man I was living with came to the hospital, saw the baby, and was like, yeah, that's not my baby. He left. And after that, I moved back in with my grandma for a short period of time. And then I moved in with another roommate who was actually the boyfriend that I had when my daughter was born. He would go on to go through some unspeakable life events, and I'm not going to speak much on it because that's his story to tell, but I just watched life beat the light out of this man. And but he still had the best heart. He was still there for me at every opportunity, even though I felt like I didn't necessarily deserve it, He was still there. And so I had my son, and I was living with my grandma. And again, grandma's is, not ideal. And so he let me move in with him. And we lived together, and I nursed my son for the first time. For the longest time, I breastfed my son for a whole year. Stayed clean throughout that time. And in February to March of 2019, I celebrated my 1-year breastfeeding mark and weaned my son. And very soon after that, I think I had actually already been dating this guy. that found me on Facebook, who I would go on to learn was in recovery from opiates. And in my mind, that was a green flag. He was in recovery for opiates. I was in recovery for amphetamines. And we both hated the other's DOC. So we started seeing each other. We started working together. And eventually, he and I planned to move in together. So I go on to save up to get my own apartment. We move in together. Within a few months after we move in together, we relapse on his DOC. And that was the start of my opiate addiction, which I would go on to battle for about 5 or 6 months. In July of 2019, I had my first and last overdose. I overdosed at my work. My dad found me. My dad had gotten out of prison in 2018, reached out to me. He needed a job. I got him a job where I was working, and our relationship never really evolved beyond that because my dad, he downplayed his guilt in the situation that perspired that led him to be incarcerated. He does not take full accountability. And again, the evidence against him was very condemning, and I have my own memories about, who he was and just how sick he was. And that told me that he's not a safe adult. And I have my kids, so unfortunately that wasn't a relationship that I was really able to pursue. However, we did work together. And he and one of my friends did find me overdosed in my car. I woke up in an ambulance in my work parking lot. They had to give me Narcan. I went to the hospital, made a full recovery. My mom and my dad were both there when I woke up in the hospital room. That would have been my first time and my last time seeing my parents under the same roof. Fast forward to October of 2019, September of 2019. This guy and I are so toxic, so volatile. We're still struggling to get clean together. He's lying, he's stealing, he's deceiving. And we both knew we were at the end of our relationship. And then all of a sudden, boom, he gets me pregnant. And I got very angry when he got me pregnant because all the months we had been together, we had been safe and managing. And I believe that he did it to trap me. And I knew that I was not having this baby. At this point, I was in a financial situation where I was able to make the decision for myself to get an abortion. And this is when I got my second abortion, was September of 2019. I would continue using after that, right up to October of 2019, when DCFS came knocking on my door. They confronted me with accusations of drug use while, a child was living in the home. And I remember when I got this knock on the door being so full of shame and thinking that that was the end of me because, I had already lost 2 children. And now here I am, I have this other one, and now the world knows I'm using. I thought that was it. I didn't think I was going to survive this, and little did I know this was the turning point that I needed. So I placed my son in the care of my aunt. DCFS will always try to place children with family before they put them in the system. My aunt was kind enough to take him in, and I checked into rehab within the same week. I do want to tell the story about how that came to fruition because it is God. It's God's hand that this came about. But there was this girl that was really close to the girl that I had been running around with. And she messaged me on Messenger and asked me she was like, I heard you're not doing well. Would you be open to going to treatment? And I originally told her absolutely not. I had really terrible insurance. I had already attempted a state-funded rehabs at some point in 2014, and it was terrible. And I told her I couldn't afford it, and she said that she could get me a scholarship and to look into it. It was this really awesome recovery center that just opened. It's called Sauna Lake Recovery Center, and she said she could get me a free ride. So I looked into it. I could not believe what I saw, and I was like, yes, please. Like, when do you need me to be there? And she was like, I need you to be there tonight. So this is like within a couple of days of DFS knocking on my door. And I wasn't really sure if it was the right decision, but I did know that I couldn't do this on my own. I was to a point of full submission. I knew I didn't have the resources. I didn't have the knowledge to get better. And so this was kind of like my last stitch effort. So I check in to Sauna Lake on October 25th, 2019. And that would be the start of my recovery journey. I completed the program in November of 2019. And that's actually where I met the man that would go on to become my husband. He was everything I ever wanted in one. And I knew right then that he was it. After treatment, I was able to return back to my apartment. I got a job. I walked my written service agreement, got reunification with my son within exactly 1 year. That's the minimum amount of time you can do it, is 1 year. So October 2020. Brandon and I are together at this time. We decide we want to start a family. And we got pregnant with our daughter in August of 2020. Got married in November of 2020. I was baptized the day after we got married, and it was November 15th of 2020. Our wedding anniversary is the 14th. We bought our first house in March of 2020. We petitioned the court for termination of guardianship in June of 2021. We're awarded guardianship in May 2022. The kids returned home that summer. They've been with us ever since. I graduated cosmetology school in December 2022. I wish I could say, it's been all rainbows and butterflies since the start of recovery, but unfortunately that's not the case. In December 2022, we experienced our first miscarriage with baby Sutton. That baby would have been due in August of 2023. So that was a really hard thing to get over, to know that I had gone through, six pregnancies, 6 healthy pregnancies, and to be told that we were experiencing a miscarriage for the 7th one was just really bizarre. In July of 2023, my youngest son's dad passed away due to an overdose. He had a period of clean time and had one slip up, and we lost him. So my son was about the same age as my daughter was when she lost her biological dad. My oldest son's father still is not in the picture. But they have Brandon, and Brandon's incredible. My in-laws are incredible. Hunter's family is incredible. We really have been blessed with an army, where you lack, God will provide, and where what you lose, God will restore that and then some. And that's what I've been seeing in this 5 years that I have been in recovery, is just restoration beyond my wildest dreams. That is the end of my testimony. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for listening. It's a really vulnerable place that I put myself in when I share bits of where I come from, but I really think it's important. The details are important. It's pertinent for you guys to know just how dark it was, so that you can really see how bright and how much work the Holy Spirit has done in transforming my life and transforming me and transforming those around me. It has been such a journey, and I'm finally to a point where I can say that I wouldn't change a thing. I know that everything was meant to happen the way it was, the way it did, and every life experience that we go through qualifies us to help someone else. And that's really the whole point of what I'm doing and why I'm sitting here today. If you have any questions, or you identify with any parts of my story, or if you're someone who just wants to come on and have a conversation and have an opportunity to share some insight that you have, that you believe has the ability and the power to help others and transform others, please don't hesitate to reach out, because that is my mission here with For the Good podcast, and that's the calling that God has put on my life. So I am really just leaning into trying to be obedient to Him and to that in this season. And my testimony is my story, but it's really just a testament of the Holy Spirit and how He moves and how He works. And I give all glory to God. Thank you for watching.